many people comprised this sect, and what were their unique practices and doctrines?
Let's get to the easy part of how many people. If you want to know how many people lived at the place, so apparently it was only up to a possibility at the most of several hundred. Now, members outside, because of the way they describe themselves, well, this gets to the question, can we use the Essene comparison? If they are the Essenes, then we know it's several thousand people scattered through the country. If they're not the Essenes, it's probably a similar number of people. Right? We have to remember that most Jews were not members of sects. Josephus tells us that most of the Jews followed the Pharisaic way. We've come to use a term called common Judaism for the average person in Second Temple times, but they weren't members. I hate to use this comparison, but it really is a good one. Those of us who remember when there was such a thing as the Soviet Union, and I know one can make unfunny jokes about its possible return in the present, but leaving that aside, right, those of us who remember it, remember that the number of members of the party was about 15%. And I think that this is an example of the fact that most people were just not involved in these affairs. So most of the Jews were not members of some kind of a group. And probably we're talking about a couple of thousand people who are the core of each one of these groups that we say existed. So to get back now to the question of the particular beliefs and ideas. So first of all, we have to emphasize that most of Judaism was shared by all these sectarian groups. On the other hand, there are specific beliefs to this group. One specific belief to this group is predestination, the idea that everything was predetermined by God and that there is no free will. You just think you have free will. Another specific idea of this sectarian group is that they sort of picture this group as having a tremendous apocalyptic messianic ideology. There's going to be a great war. The war is going to lead to the Messianic era. It's going to happen soon. In fact, they may have thought that that was what was happening when the Romans conquered the land of Israel in 63 BCE. So that's another thing, what we could call extreme messianism. Another area is that they seem to follow an approach to Jewish law and interpretation of the Bible that is very similar to that of the Sadducees, perhaps identical to that of the Sadducees. That's another main idea or belief. But we should be careful because they're loaded with things that are the same as regular traditional Judaism. Just give one example. The first Sabbath law says that the Sabbath begins when the sun is distant from the horizon by its own circumference. And then they quote the verse, observe the Sabbath to sanctify it. Well, this is exactly the same as the later rabbis who say you have to start keeping Shabbat a little bit before sunset. And they quote the very same verse. And I could go on like that, but I want to go on with another example from the Sabbath, which shows you how things may be parallel but slightly different. And that is that whereas in rabbinic literature, you have a Sabbath limit of 2,000 cubits outside of the settled area that you're permitted to go, here you have two Sabbath limits. One Sabbath limit, which is general, of 1,000, and the other of 2,000 if you're pasturing an animal. Now, you may ask where this comes from. If you look at the end of the book of Numbers, you'll see that the passage from which the rabbis derived the 2,000 also mentions 1,000. And it's hard to tell what's 1,000 and what's 2,000 in that passage. Well, they had a slightly different idea, but it's in the same spirit of ideas. That's the point that I'm making, that it's not all as far off as someone might expect if you're thinking, for example, of political parties today. And you expect, that somebody is for abortion, anti-abortion, right? These things are not exactly like that. The question is, how do you observe the Torah? And there are different ideas about how to do that correctly among these various sectarian groups.